Hi, this is Sophia, one of the producers of the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Before we start this episode, we want to take a moment to talk about shame. Shame is everywhere in medical culture. For Docs with Disabilities, shame is a persistent feeling reinforced by our ableist society. This fall, the award-winning medical storytelling podcast, The Nocturnists, launched a 10-episode documentary series called Shame in Medicine: The Lost Forest. This series breaks the silence around shame in the medical profession by exploring clinician stories about training, exam scores, mistakes, being sued, and failing to conform to the ideal of the quote-unquote healthcare hero. Episode 8, In Hiding, airs Tuesday, November 1st, and includes the stories of docs and future docs with disabilities. In this episode, The Nocturnists explores the masks we wear and how, in medicine, we often bring a curated version of self to work, one that fits into an unspoken code of conduct. The right mask, it is believed, will win the respect and trust of our colleagues and protect us from painful judgments and feelings of alienation. In Episode 8, the Nocturnists ask the question, what are the side effects of hiding parts of ourselves at work? And what about the parts of ourselves that remain exposed? We encourage all of our followers to tune into this episode and to engage with the entire Lost Forest series. By foregrounding untold personal stories of our healthcare workforce, The Nocturnist brings a human-centered perspectives to the big questions facing our alien healthcare system. Listen on your favorite podcast app and visit thenocturnists-shame.org to learn more. Now we jump into today's Docs with Disabilities episode.
Doctors with disabilities exist in small but impactful numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges?
What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences?
And how do these experiences differ within different medical systems?
I'm Lisa Meeks.
I'm Peter Poulos.
And I'm Quentin Clark from the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. And together we are thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast Canadian series.
Over the next 6 weeks, we are excited to present a 6-episode collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities.
Join us as we explore the stories of learners and providers who study or practice in Canada.
Welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. In this episode, we continue our collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities for a conversation with Dr. Michael Quon about the lessons he learned from his own experience with traumatic brain injury and the work he's doing to support physicians with disabilities across Canada. We begin with an introduction from Dr. Quon.
My name is Michael Quon. I am a general internist in Ottawa, practicing at the Ottawa Hospital. I'm an active clinician teacher, and I practice with residents and medical students, primarily in inpatient work and also some outpatient teaching clinics. But more importantly for this podcast, I am a patient, and I am a traumatic brain injury survivor, and I've lived experience that has impacted my motivation to participate and advocate in this work. And since my recovery and rehabilitation, I've been a big disability inclusion advocate, both in Ottawa as well as the province of Ontario and Canada more broadly, in terms of efforts to improve inclusion for physicians with disabilities. My injury was back in 2015, and it was right at the end of my residency training. So I was on a cycling trip actually in Colorado with some friends. I was in an unwitnessed crash on a descent My two friends were ahead of me at the time of the accident, so we actually have no idea what happened because I have no memory of that day. Additionally, I don't have any memories for the next 3 weeks, and so I started making memories again in a brain injury inpatient rehabilitation unit, thousands of kilometers away back in Ottawa. And so the next stage of things was very difficult in terms of rehabilitating myself from all the symptoms I was having and eventually reintegrating back to work. I had just finished my medical training. I didn't really feel like I understood until I was there. And that's just it. I think, as a patient, the feeling of being cared for by your medical providers, they were all so important to me as a patient. And it was a light bulb moment for me because I felt as though I didn't learn this in my medical education. And I was just at the end of my medical training. And so from a patient perspective, it just felt like wow, I can't believe I didn't learn this.
I think that's the golden quote, right? I can't believe I didn't learn this. Not understanding what it means to be a patient and what's so important to the patient in that very short amount of time and space that you have. And so you said you were at the end of your training. How does this experience inform the work that you do now? And in particular, how does it inform how you interact with patients, but also how does it shape what you teach to your students or what you highlight?
I do try to bring a different teaching angle to, the residents and medical students, rather than focus strictly on medical expertise and clinical teaching topics. I try to engage with the trainees on how to form connections with patients and how to sort of communicate most effectively and empathically with patients. And it's a challenge, I have to say, because I don't really have a lot of role models who did that in my own training. But I've already received various pieces of good feedback from trainees about how this was unique and important to do. And so there's certainly a lot of room for growth there.
It's so interesting, I think, this idea that you bring up that you didn't have a lot of mentors really to teach you how to teach others to be more empathic towards disability. One of the things that we know from the research is that in coming into medicine, a trainee is far more empathic than their non-medical peers. Yet, by the time they finish their clinical training, their empathy is worse towards people with disabilities than their non-medical peers. And so much of the kind of hypothesized reasoning around why this phenomenon exists is that in the clinical space, there is only modeled behavior of how we talk about disability and how we treat patients with disability. There's this idea that the learners are in a very covert way being taught that patients with disabilities are problematic. They're not an easy fix. They're more complicated. They're more troublesome. And we see this turn after the clinical years. So we know that it's likely happening in the clinical space. So this is actually where it's so important to model appropriate disability humble care. And how do you break this cycle? How do you bring a respect for and a humility towards treating individuals with disabilities to the educational space?
I researched this extensively. I was also interested to see that trend from increased empathy to decreased empathy throughout training. I understood it. I think I probably I probably was one of those people myself. I think, unfortunately, the clinical care is very time consuming, and there's a lot of information to learn, and the focus priority gets placed on doing the right medical care, which is obviously extremely important. It's just to the detriment of not focusing on the rest of care for patients. And so I do understand a bit about how it has become this way, and I'm very interested in how we can try to reverse this, especially in the medical education. Because as you say, these are the years where people change, and these are the years where people are getting educated most. And so isn't this an interesting time to sort of try to improve this?
In the next section, Dr. Meeks and Dr. Quon discuss the efforts that Dr. Quon is taking to make Ottawa Hospital and other institutions throughout Canada more inclusive and supportive of physicians with disabilities.
I've been fortunate to have some great leadership at the Ottawa Hospital and in the equity and diversity and inclusion space. In particular, my colleague, Dr. Camille Monroe, has really led this work at the Ottawa Hospital, and I've collaborated, but she's the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Department of Medicine. And then additionally, Dr. Kathleen Gartke, who is the Senior Medical Officer at the hospital, has sort of been the senior leadership and helped us navigate this work. And so I feel really fortunate that I've been able to partner with both of them. The position statement we had formally approved just last year goes over a set of principles on the value and inclusion of physicians with disabilities, and it also goes through principles around reducing and eliminating barriers and providing them equitable opportunities. So it goes through a set of principles like this, which are all strongly worded, and I think they were quite impactful in themselves. But then additionally, the position statement recommends that all the departments create inclusive policies for physicians with disabilities. So it's really more than a mission statement, in that it's recommending policy development. And additional to policy development, it's recommending education of leaders, physician leaders, on reasonable accommodations and accessibility issues for physicians with disabilities.
That is amazing. Amazing. And for the listeners, we will be linking to a couple of resources, some articles, definitely that statement. And wow, what would it look like if in the United States, hospitals and hospital systems adopted this statement? That would be pretty incredible. And it's mind-blowing to think that this is happening out there. It's pretty progressive, and I just want to personally thank you for your work on that. And just I'm amazed that the statement is out there and being shared so broadly and adopted so broadly.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just mention that at the beginning of this work, I reached out to you and was asking, do you know if there's any hospitals out there with any policy for physicians with disabilities? And I think you responded to me, unfortunately, you didn't know of any. Either way, I thank you for recognizing this. I think it is really valuable, and to our knowledge, it's the first and only of its kind in Canada as well. And so even since its implementation, we've had a lot of interest. It's been shared very extensively in all the Provincial Medical Association newsletters. It's been published, but then also was shared by our Provincial Medical Association online. And so there's a lot of interest in it. And since then, there's already been a hospital in Montreal has really liked it, and they've adapted it to Montreal and Quebec provincial setting, and it's been approved. So it's already been approved in another large institution in Montreal that's affiliated with McGill. And so we're already seeing some impact of sharing it. I think it's really an exciting time to be working in this. I've looked to your work as leading research and policy and recommendations, and to collaborate with you on any further leadership work in this field. I mean, that's a real privilege for me to be able to be part of that.
Thank you. It's such a privilege for me to be able to do this work. And I always thank people for recognizing the work. But then I take a step back and say, while my name may be associated with so much of the work, it's not possible without all of my colleagues who are just amazing and collaborative and very focused, not on themselves or promoting their own careers, but really on improving the space for others. And so I always say, it's our work collectively. And it does feel that way. It feels like, there's just such an incredible community. Hopefully we'll marry our Canadian and US groups together and do a lot more.
The conversation now shifts to discuss the differences between visible and invisible disabilities. Listen or read along as Dr. Meeks and Dr. Quon consider the unique challenges faced by learners and physicians with cognitive disabilities and the importance of fostering a trusting relationship with one's colleagues and superiors.
This may be a difficult question, and I think that it's difficult for many people that have disabilities, but I think it's an important question for our audience. So there are certainly barriers for people with apparent disabilities, and while they might not be the same, there are an equal number of barriers for people that have what we might term non-apparent disabilities, especially in that cognitive realm. So that would include things like your disability as a TBI survivor, mental health disabilities. It could be learning disabilities, ADHD, things of that nature. And I think that there are differences in the types of barriers that these trainees face as they enter the medical training pathway. One of those barriers is that we have difficulty constructing something that we can't see, right? And we also have such difficulty in the medical community accepting that somebody that has a cognitive-based disability could practice medicine. I think that creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I wonder, because you are a person with what we would call a non-apparent disability, what your thoughts are.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I completely agree. I think there's a lot of potential for misunderstanding and stigma around having a non-apparent disability. Coming from personal experience, having no obvious disability, I think there's added challenges with how to disclose disability and how to share that and how to request accommodations. And I think there's, in a way, a bit more challenge in terms of self-advocacy to show that you have a disability, which is different, I could imagine anyways, from somebody who had an obvious physical disability. My rehabilitation, I was more concerned about the optics of it. Oh, are people going to put my clinical work under more of a microscope, and does my quality of work have to be really perfect in a way to avoid people thinking I'm not competent or not acceptable in the quality of care. So I think I even shared a bit of that concern that my colleagues or leadership might be feeling. In a way, though, personally, I felt I probably over-exaggerated that. Once I got into the clinical work, I didn't feel that same pressure or expectations. And I mean, that's my own experience. I'm sure everybody's different, and I'm sure different disabilities probably continue to feel that in a longer way.
The idea about disclosure, right, is a little bit different in that I think that threshold for believability is there, right? Will they believe me and believe that I need an accommodation for full access because it's not apparent that I have a disability? And then on the flip side of that, there's also the risk that if you tell someone, similar to what you're saying, you'll be hyper supervised, hyper assessed, hyper everything, that the belief systems are so strong that whoever's assessing you, whoever's supervising you will, whether consciously or unconsciously, will over assess, right? Over manage, over supervise. And that's problematic because it sets up this tension that underpins that relationship. The relationship in that kind of cycle can never thrive. Where I've seen physician supervisor relationships thrive is when two people sit down and have a conversation about the disability and how does this affect you and what measures do you take, as any physician would take, for those checks and balances, right? What's already part of the system that will ensure that, whether it's processing, memory, attention, whatever it is, that will compensate for any concerns? How do you personally compensate? How do you, self-accommodate? And then what do we need to add to the system to assist, with the belief, as both parties, come to the table, that the physician is competent and the physician will do a good job. We just need to make sure the environment's accessible. And so under those circumstances, I think that's where physicians thrive. And even as you have, take leadership roles in medicine. So part of that is just myth busting, right? Getting rid of this idea that people with cognitive disabilities can't be physicians. And I think that's incredibly important.
You mentioned there that partnership. I just found that was such an insightful comment about having that transparency and that open communication between the physician with disability and physician leadership. And I do think that's a big area for growth. I think perhaps the physician with disability might not initiate that conversation. I'm not sure, but I also think there's probably discomfort in having a deeper level conversation about what is somebody's disability and how can it be accommodated best. I think that opening that discussion, I think a lot of people, physicians, non-physicians, society at large, is not frequently comfortable with. I think it's so interesting that that's been clear to you in your work, that that's such an important part of fostering good accommodations.
Yeah, it's that trust relationship. And, there's just no other way to formulate that relationship except to have transparency and to create a safe environment where people feel like they can disclose and have these conversations, and that the conversations are iterative, that they're not a one-time disclosure, here's what we're doing, that's it, but that you can also go back and say, look, this worked for me before, it's not working now. What other types of, whether it's assistive technology or anything under that accommodation umbrella, what might we try? And to be creative in that space too, to not just rely on the three things that everybody knows are part of the accommodations toolkit, but to say, let's think outside the box. Like what could we do?
In the next section, Dr. Meeks and Dr. Quon discuss how the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the need to develop robust systems to accommodate and support physicians with disabilities.
It's interesting. I can't help but think in the back of my mind about the wave of physicians and nurses who, for the last 2 years, stood in the wards, rolled into the wards, did an incredible job, and got COVID. And the 30% or so that the CDC is predicting will develop long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And the cognitive symptoms
Mm-hmm.
that are part of that diagnosis and the impact that that will have on thousands of people. And so as a profession, I think we need to be honest about the fact that not only are we losing physicians in general and facing shortages, we are losing physicians for reasons that have to do with people choosing their mental health over being a physician, right? Leaving the workforce because the workforce isn't healthy in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
But then this other wave of physicians that will be experiencing symptoms like cognitive fogging, memory lapse, all of these things that are cognitive in nature that are similar in some ways to TBI.
Yep.
And that will think, I cannot be a physician anymore because of this, because they won't know, right? It's not general knowledge that there are accommodations for disability, that there are workarounds in the system. We've done a great job, I think, in the last 5 years of elevating this conversation, but it's not everyday conversation. If I go, to my physician and they ask me what I do for a living and I tell them, they're probably going to be a little bit surprised, right?
Yeah.
So it's not part of the general conversation. And yet we have this wave of people coming, and they're going to have some of the same symptoms that you experienced, and they're going to probably need some of the same accommodations. So I can't help but think this work will have more applicability in the next 5 years than it has had in the last 5. And it'll be interesting to see.
Well, for sure. And not to mention the long COVID, physical and cognitive symptoms, but there's also a lot of physicians who have faced additional mental health challenges throughout the last couple of years. And there's certainly going to be a wave of people who need and would benefit from being accommodated differently.
Yeah. I was talking to one of my colleagues who does a lot of work in this space, and they said it is more likely that you've developed a psychological disability over the course of the last 2 years than to have come out of what we went through and are continuing to go without some sort of psychological impact. We're looking at an entire physician workforce who will be looking to the disability community if they know to look, or they'll be looking to leave the workforce. And we need people, we need physicians in the workforce, but we also need physicians with disabilities, kind of bringing this back to the statement for Canadian hospitals. And it's important that we provide a structure and almost a navigation tool to guide the hospital system in assisting physicians and all of our really important healthcare workers, nurses, PTs, OTs, SLPs, PAs, and doing this work and remaining in the workforce and contributing in a new, but I think a really important way.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think it's such a unique time. Obviously, there's been major challenges on so many levels, but strictly on this disability inclusion space, it's such a unique time, as you say, because there are so many more people who have limitations, health limitations, whether or not they self-report or self-disclose as having a disability, they would benefit from being accommodated. And how do we create a culture where people are more willing to disclose, I think, right? That to me is so complicated because ableism in society at large, as well as in medicine, and personal values, I think there's a lot of hesitation around saying and even almost admitting to yourself that you have a disability. And I can say from a personal experience, earlier on, I would have had a very difficult time saying I am disabled.
Yeah.
That's probably because I held ableism thoughts going into this injury and experience. And probably also because I felt that in the culture of medicine and in society. And so it's an interesting conversation. I don't think I have an answer for you, but there's certainly a lot of probable ways we can make it more safe for people and make it more inclusive and make it more of a positive admission or disclosure rather than just admitting, oh, I can't do this and I need to do this differently and it's hard because of this. And it's sort of framed almost as a what can you not do, as opposed to what have you learned from your experience? What positive learning and experiences have you gained from your disability experience, and how can you share that with, a healthcare environment? And how can you improve patient care? And how can you enhance the care of our institution? And I think, to me, that's the big shift is the accommodations to how can you offer something differently to our physician group or institution.
I love that. How do we train physicians as they're going into these job opportunities, the interview or in residency interviews, to flip that script, to move from a model of deficit and a conversation about deficit to a conversation about this is who I am and these are the strengths it brings to the training environment?
In this final section, Dr. Quon shares his insights on how learners and physicians with disabilities can flip the switch to celebrate what their disability has taught them and highlight the importance of making medical communities more inclusive.
At the beginning with this Docs with Disabilities, this whole thing grew out of this idea of how do we provide asynchronous mentoring for people in the pathway. And now it's kind of grown to also include opportunities to educate other stakeholders, so leaders, faculty members in this space. But the question is simple. It's what advice would you have either for a learner or for a program?
Well, thank you for that question, because as you mentioned, the flipping the switch, I've done this naturally in a couple of informal mentorship conversations with trainees with either mainly hidden or non-apparent disability. I had said to them, this is an opportunity to own the disability and also show that you have learned some important insight that can benefit patients and can benefit other colleagues with disabilities or trainees with disabilities. And in the current climate in medicine, this is increasingly important. Physician wellness has really taken off and has become an issue everywhere and a priority for institutions. So inclusion and accommodations and disability inclusion applies directly to the wellness of physicians. And then in addition, it applies to the equity, diversity, and inclusion space, which is also grown extensively in industry and in healthcare. And we're seeing it with new committees and new working groups popping up all the time in trying to create a more inclusive physician workforce and equitable workforce. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us as physicians with disabilities to really lead a lot of this work and have a lot of impact in making medicine more inclusive. We need to be owning and sharing this information and being a part of Docs with Disabilities podcast. Because this is essentially what I'm talking about. This is this sharing of the experience and then making it a positive aspect of your career and your non-clinical work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, I am so grateful, so incredibly grateful to the Canadian Association for Physicians with Disabilities and to this partnership. There will be lots of resources available and linked in the transcript to this episode. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be a part of this work.
To our guest, Dr. Quon, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We are so grateful for your honesty and insight in sharing your story, and so appreciative of the work you're doing to help make Canadian hospitals more inclusive to physicians with disabilities. To our audience, thank you for tuning into this episode. We encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, check out the other episodes in our collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities, and tune in next time. We also encourage you to check out the International Conference on Academic Medicine, which will be hosted by the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada in Quebec City in April of 2023. The keynote for the conference will focus on ableism in medicine. Head to icam-cimu.com to learn more. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative as part of a special collaboration with the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. This podcast is supported in part by the University of Michigan Medical School Department of Family Medicine and Disability Program, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, and the Ford Foundation. This series was made possible through funding from the Canadian Federation of Medical Students Strategic Innovation Fund. The opinions on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the respective institutions, partner organizations, or funders. It is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Non-Derivative License. This series was developed by Quentin Clark and Lisa Meeks and produced by Lisa Meeks, Sophia Schlossman, and Jacob Feeman.